Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's May 29th, 2021. And Helga, since the last time we spoke, it's now been confirmed that there will be a summit between President Biden and President Putin of Russia. This will take place in Geneva on June 16th. Now, while the United States said we're looking for a more stable relationship, they're continuing to put sanctions on Russia. Uh, you said that this is an opportunity to put an end to geopolitics. How do you see things developing toward this summit?
Well, I think under present circumstances and the past years, where the relationship between the United States and Russia had reached a historic low point, the fact that this summit takes place at all, I think, is the important fact. I think that it's much better to talk than to have all this series of confrontations. So therefore, I think both sides have expressed satisfaction that the meeting takes place. However, the Russians are not exuberant because, as the deputy ambassador to the United Nations, Polyansky, just said, that there are many cases where the U.S. was capricious and conditions were put up as a precondition. So this has not occurred so far, and therefore they are looking towards it with a certain expectation, but not the miracle solution to all problems. So let's hope, that there will be a positive discussion about strategic issues, other important issues like the pandemic, the financial crisis, and not just climate change and the agenda of the City of London and Wall Street. So I think also important is the statement which was made by a spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, saying that nobody should hope that a positive meeting between the United States and Russia would somehow break the relationship between Russia and China. So I think, there is a potential that the summit could be a first step in the right direction. And hopefully the other proposal by President Putin to go for a UN Security Council, five permanent member of the UN Security Council meeting, that would follow and address then the really urgent global issues. But it's a building process, so I think the more people are discussing solutions, the better. So let's hope it works in a positive direction.
I think it's significant in the build up to the summit that you were invited to deliver an address at an important conference online in Russia in the last couple of days. What was the conference and what was the topic you addressed?
Well, this was the Moscow Academic Economic Forum, actually a very big conference. I think most of the important businessmen, financial institutions, top politicians participated in it. And we have not yet fully evaluated all the many panels because it was a huge conference. I was invited to a subsection which took place in the financial university, and I spoke about basically the choices which are on the agenda. On the one side, the Great Reset and the idea to impose alternative energies globally, to redirect oil financing into green financing, as compared to the need to build up the economy of the developing countries, which is more the road of China, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I discussed the economic principle of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who very importantly developed this idea that there is a direct connection between the energy flux density used in the production process and the correlation of the relative potential population density, which can be carried by each level of energy flux density. With other words, that if you go only to wind and solar and hydropower, then the population potential is very low because the energy flux density is very low. And obviously, this is the hidden implication of the Green Deal and the Green New Deal, that with it goes, even if it's not discussed, not only an increase in the prices of energy and therefore a complete collapse of the living standard of many people who simply cannot afford energy and many other things anymore, and therefore it implies the danger of leading to social chaos in the industrialized countries who already are extremely tense in the aftermath of the pandemic, the lockdowns, a lot of loss of jobs. So if you now go for the Green Deal, you create havoc and you deindustrialize the so-called advanced sector. But for the developing countries, it would be absolutely catastrophic, because it would simply mean that there's no development. It would mean basically cementing the poverty, the underdevelopment, and under present conditions of pandemic and and world famine, it would mean a massive depopulation. And that, in my view, is what some of the Malthusians who are pushing the Great Reset, they wouldn't be unhappy about, because they think the world is overpopulated anyway. So this is, a very dangerous development. And, I thought that in response to my speech, I thought there were quite different reactions. Some people being on board with the Green Deal simply because they made the argument, well, what should we do? The EU set the rules, so we have to react. But others understanding quite well that that this is not in affinity with the laws of the physical economy and the requirements of the population. So let's see what will come out of it, because I think the Russians and the Chinese do not have the same model of anthropogenic climate change, but they have a much more balanced view, looking at all the different aspects of it, including motions in the solar system and oscillations in the astronomical developments. So they have generally a much more clear, more scientific orientation than many of the ideologues in the West.
Well, speaking of ideologues in the West, given what's going on in Germany, it would seem to be very useful if you were invited to address some of these similar kinds of forums at German universities. Because what we're seeing now is the lineup of the Greens, who may end up in the government, as a war party, in addition to their continued commitment to deindustrialization. What are the latest developments that you've been following?
Well, I think the Greens have completely demasked themselves, that, out of a party of green hippies knitting socks and, wearing, jute dresses, I don't know this word in English, basically materials of environment-friendly textiles, they have transformed into a war party. I mean, this started really with Joschka Fischer, who agreed being in the government in 1999 with the bombing against Yugoslavia. And, if you look at Baerbock and Habeck, you can actually see Baerbock was in a virtual conference with the Atlantic Council recently. And, afterwards, the Atlantic Council wrote quite telling a headline, Atlantic Council, Baerbock in sync with Joe Biden. And indeed, she said everything which is really on the confrontation with Russia, with China, taking a harder stand against those two countries, being in complete sync with the confrontation. So that's really very clear, and I think people are slowly waking up to that. That was reinforced when Habeck, the so-called number two, who, he just went to Ukraine. He met with President Zelensky, and then from Ukraine basically said that it's completely understandable when Ukraine wants to have weapons. They have the right to have defensive weapons. I mean, in the program, first of all, I think in the German Grundgesetz, but also even in the program of the Greens, it says very clearly there should be no weapons export to crisis areas or countries where there are wars, which clearly is the case for Ukraine. And for Habeck to not recognize, that this government in the Ukraine is a very, very mixed bag, to say the least. I mean, the coup in 2014 was sponsored by the State Department. Victoria Nuland bragged about it quite shamelessly. And in it came Nazi groups, which are still, integrated in the parliament, in the government, in the army. And naturally, if you supply weapons to that government, you are arming the Nazis for a war against Russia, which is quite an incredible incredible thing. And there is really no such thing as defensive weapons, because almost any weapon can be turned into an offensive weapon under certain circumstances. But this has caused quite an uproar. I think even from within the Green Party, there are now people questioning this confrontational course. But, I think the thing with Baerbock, I mean, she has been groomed. I mean, you should think about it, how comes that all of a sudden, at the point when the financial system is bankrupt, there's a danger of a hyperinflationary blowout of the system, which is now being talked about quite a lot. And the financial oligarchy wants to postpone that collapse by redirecting investments by the trillions. They're talking about 60, maybe $100 trillion over the next several years, investing in green finance only, green investment only, leaving all fossil-related industries, which is a gigantic, bubble, a new bubble, which is supposed to make the upper part of the speculators rich and the other ones poorer, the mass of the population poorer. That just at a moment when such a grand scheme is being launched for the United States, for the EU, for London, for some Asian countries, that at that point they pull out of the hat a Green Chancellor candidate who fits that program to the dot, who says exactly what is needed to go along with this larger scheme. Now, that is not a miracle, because she has been groomed by the World Economic Forum. She was in the Young Leaders program. She has connections to the British and the American establishment. So she is really a puppet of that oligarchy, which is trying to impose this green dictatorship. So she is just fitting that scheme completely. And if you look at the program of the Greens for Africa, green energy only, that fits exactly what Mark Carney, I think we mentioned that last time, Mark Carney is pushing with his with his carbon offset market, whereby the Africans are supposed to sign contracts that they will not develop their resources, not develop industry and agriculture, even turn aerial land back into forestation in order to keep, the carbon emissions low, very low, and then the Western firms who have emissions can sell this offset to the Africans. Which means, the underdevelopment of the developing sector, Africa, is supposed to be cemented forever. I mean, this is the open, naked reintroduction of colonialism. And, it is quite telling that the head of MI6, Her Majesty's Foreign Intelligence Service, Richard Moore, came out and said that they are regarding the policing of climate sinners as their most important job. So you not only have the reintroduction of colonialism, you already have the colonial police, to make sure that the rules are followed. I mean, this is so blatant that one can only wish that people should start thinking about these things, because normally, this passes by, and, I think it is a complete scandal.
Well, in contrast with this, we had a very significant event in Italy, which is part of an ongoing series. Italian scientists who put out a statement, "There is no climate emergency," are beginning a series of debates. I don't know if anyone's willing to debate them, but this just took place the other day where they're taking on the fake science. What can you say about that?
Well, this is an initiative which was launched, I think, already more than a year ago. And it was in the beginning 100 climate scientists who wrote an appeal to the EU, to the Italian government, to the United Nations, saying there is no climate emergency. And they basically want to have a series of such virtual debates about, what is the actual science for the thesis of climate change. And they basically make very strongly the point that the anthropogenic part of the climate change is negligible, that it's such a tiny amount that you can absolutely forget it. And that, as I mentioned earlier, the astronomical oscillations which are going on as long as the universe or the Earth, the planet Earth exists, namely that you have, for example, a 1,000-year cycle, which is completely left out of the present calculations of the IPCC, and that you have ice ages, warming periods, and that these measurements have to be taken much, much more serious. So they want to have a debate about it. And I think that is absolutely true, because in the meantime, their letter has been signed by 800 other scientists. And there is a new debate erupting inside the United States, in other European countries, where people, from the climate science field realize that if they don't speak up now, then based on this fraudulent science, all these financial schemes are being implemented, and the damage of this would be gigantic. So this is a very welcomed initiative, and any climate scientist who hears this should join it.
Now, getting back to the war threat, we see a continued escalation from the United States and NATO against Russia, in this case, using Belarus as sort of the entry point for that, with the demands for massive new sanctions, and again, creating a fraud, the Atlantic Council saying that there's no question that this plane that was brought down by Belarus was aided by Russia. And then they admit, well, there's no circumstantial evidence of this, but it had to be the case. They won't give up on this Russia question, will they?
No, because their policy is regime change against Putin, as there is regime change against Xi Jinping. They had this incredible paper a couple of months ago, the Longer Telegram, where they openly call for the opposition in the Chinese Communist Party leadership against Xi Jinping to topple him and replace him with somebody who is more agreeing to submit to the unipolar world defined by Washington. Now, the same policy against Russia they pushed with the Navalny affair, and now obviously they are using this Petra Savage, so-called blogger, who was taken out of the plane. Now, this guy is not just a simple quote journalist, because in the meantime, you have to remember that Lukashenko charged that there was an attempt to kill him. There was an attempt to create a coup in Belarus, and he is now claiming that this guy somehow was involved in these operations. Now, if that is the case, then it's a very serious charge, and obviously this requires an investigation and facts. But in the meantime, pictures have appeared of this so-called blogger who in 2014 was in the Ukraine, in the battlefield, basically being trained by the Azov battalion in bombardment, in killing of civilians. He was there in full military gear. And, I mean, this is part of the regime change apparatus. He also was in the United States. He had apparently meetings with the State Department. He was involved not only in the press work for the battalion, but also, in the fundraising. Now, these are all very nebulous things, but, there has been a policy of regime change, against Ukraine in 2004, 2014, Georgia. There was attempts in other East European states, all trying to replace neutral or Moscow-friendly countries, governments, with those who are part of the pushback of, basically the idea to topple the regime or the government of Russia. So this is, this is all not as it as it is being presented by media, which is completely put in sync. And when I listen to the German media, let it be TV or radio, it is really hair-raising because it is not one news which doesn't have a spin. And since we are following these matters, from many angles, and we are trying to get a realistic picture, it is really a brainwashing, trying to portray China, Russia as the enemies, and it's extremely dangerous. And I have to say, Ursula von der Leyen, as the president of the EU Commission, is part of this. I mean, she just said, that they will give 3 billion EU money to the opposition in Belarus, hoping for a democratic transition. So she is fully in the regime change. What is her business to decide who should be the government of any country? I mean, she is not. I mean, this is really incredible. And I think the question of sovereignty is such a precious good that I can only say that this EU is really violating any principle of the UN Charter.
Well, also going to the issue of the EU, there have been negotiations underway with Switzerland, and the Swiss just walked out. What was where were they contesting there? What was the issue?
Well, I think this is a very good example that even a small country, when they decide to fight for their sovereignty, can do it. There is a big freak out right now, but the Swiss were simply worried that if they would agree to the negotiations, all kinds of guidelines would be imposed on them, which would increase the prices, force them to cut the wages. The Swiss, for example, have very high wages and they attract a lot of foreign labor force, high-skilled labor force, and that is part of the productivity of the Swiss economy. So they were clearly completely concerned that that they would lose their sovereign self-government, and that's why they broke off these negotiations. I think this is excellent. This gives a very good example that a country which stands up can really accomplish something. And I think it has a lot to do. First of all, the Swiss have a very interesting constitution, but they also have all these referendums. They will have one of them in 3 weeks from now on the question of CO2 emissions and prices. But they also have the influence of Wilhelm Tell, who was naturally a Swiss citizen, but more importantly, the drama written by Friedrich Schiller is all about the question of sovereignty. And the Wilhelm Tell narrative coming out of this drama by Schiller has an even higher influence in Switzerland than the historic figure of Wilhelm Tell. So, as you know, the Rüttli Oath of Wilhelm Tell is very similar to the Declaration of Independence in the United States. At that crucial moment of the Rüttli Oath, these people basically say that there is a lawfulness, a natural law hanging in the stars. And that lawfulness is something you can appeal to, which helps to defeat the tyrant. And says, no, a limit has the power of the tyrant. It's a very beautiful little oath. And if you compare the Rüttli oath with the Declaration of Independence, it is very clear that Schiller was inspired by the Declaration, and it came to excellent use. And as you can see, it's working into the present.
Yeah, these kinds of legends and stories actually help shape a national culture. Now, I want to get to the question of what's going on with the vaccinations. Dr. Tedros has been out talking about this in the last couple of days in regard to vaccinating children. But there's also the whole question of the U.S. continuing to hoard vaccines when they're drastically needed around the world. So give us a quick update on this.
Well, I think, what Dr. Tedros said in a recent appeal, he was expressing, horror about the fact that some countries are hoarding. As a matter of fact, I think the US has more than 100 million doses, I think even more than that, sitting in warehouses not being used, while, the situation in many countries, almost every third world countries, but especially countries, in Latin America, Brazil, Peru, India, the neighbors of India, and many African countries, they are in a dire need, such that even if the full production program of all the different pharmaceutical companies goes on, by September, there will be only 10% of the world population vaccinated. I mean, that's really not a lot. So what Dr. Tedros said is that what people have to realize is that it is really absolutely wrong to vaccinate young children who have a low risk of getting seriously sick through the coronavirus, when even the health workers in the developing countries are not being vaccinated, who are high risk people. So I think there must be a rethinking, and this is why we keep pushing the idea of the World Health System, because unless people understand that this pandemic and coming pandemics, of which Tedros and many other people are warning, until every country has a modern health system, this pandemic will not be defeated and it will come back. And the big danger looming is that variations, mutations will develop, which will make the original vaccines obsolete. And then we would be in a real crisis. So, that is why people should join the Committee of Coincidence of Opposite and the Schiller Institute and help us to fight for such a change, because a life in Mali or in Haiti or in any other country is as holy and sacred as a life in the United States, in Germany, or any other country on the globe.
And Helga, the themes we've been discussing today, the strategic situation, the war danger, the insanity of the Green New Deal, and just what you brought up now, the question of a world health system, these will be the main topics of an upcoming Schiller Institute conference, which we're building as an effort to create an anti-Malthusian opposition. What's the latest on this conference?
Well, as you said, this is the continuation. I mean, first of all, we will address as a very urgent question the danger of a hyperinflationary blowout of the system, which is now, becoming very clear that this relentless money pumping, QE, injection of large so-called recovery programs, stimulus programs, which all went into the building of the bubble and not in investments in the real economy. This is now starting to show with very high inflation rates. And the Bank of England ridiculously said that this is a temporary hyperinflation. This is like saying a woman is a little bit pregnant and it will go away. Once you start this process, you end up like Germany in 1923, a hyperinflationary blowout, and we are on that road. So that will be discussed, as well as naturally what is the solution to that: global Glass-Steagall banking separation in the tradition of Roosevelt, and the full program, new Bretton Woods, but also the issues we talked about in this last half hour. So you should mark the date, 26th and 27th of June. You should make sure you participate in it, and become active, help us, because the Schiller Institute is a very, very important voice in the world, which is recognized by many, but it does need much more recognition, because the mainstream media are all going in the opposite direction.
And you can, as Helga said earlier, join the Schiller Institute. You can share these videos. You can go to the LaRouche organization website and get your friends involved. Get the pamphlet, The Great Leap Backwards, which exposes in great detail the Green New Deal and also presents the alternative. So Helga, thank you. We've covered a lot today. I guess we'll see you sometime next week.
Till next week.